Carter, and I'm a psychologist. I teach at Oxford College, and my disruption and innovation is talking about the psychology of thrill-seeking. And one of the things I feel like is sort of a superpower for me is the ability to try to take something that is kind of dull, which is sometimes research in psychology sometimes, and if I can get you to think about something, a person in a way where you go from, that's weird about you, to, oh, I get you now, which is what I'm hoping that you'll do with the psychology of thrill-seeking. Now, when I first got into this interesting research, I want you to try something that there's a psychologist named Paul Ekman that says that humans are actually very good at something, which is understanding what emotions people are experiencing just from their facial expressions. So let's try a couple. What emotion do you think that she's experiencing right now? Joy, excitement. Yeah, she seems kind of happy. Let's try another one. Not as excited, a little bit more scared. The interesting thing is they're actually sitting right next to each other. One of my favorite websites is Roller Coaster Faces, where you can actually see the expressions that people are experiencing. And to me, this is really interesting because they're actually sitting right next to each other. They're experiencing exactly the same thing, but they're having a very different emotional reaction from it. And it's this kind of thing that got me interested in the psychology and the neuroscience of thrill seekers. Now, when you think of a thrill seeker, you probably think of a guy like this. This is one of the very first people I interviewed for my book. This guy's name is Mark, and Mark loves to go hiking. Any of you like going hiking at all? Okay, how many of you would like to go hiking with Mark? He loves taking these selfies on tops of these little mountain tops. Any of you would like to go hiking with him at all? It's hard to know. Yeah, one. Okay. I'm looking for more thrill seekers for my book. Yeah. So Mark, yes, he loves to go hiking, and when you think of someone like Mark, you're thinking of a thrill seeker. Now, the research that I actually started looking at was actually a different psychological concept, which is the concept that's called sensation seeking. And the history of sensation seeking got started in a very different way than you might think. It got started in a dark room where they were actually looking at nothing. What they were actually researching was sensory deprivation. They put them in these dark rooms, and this is called the Gansfield technique. They put them in these dark rooms, put a bright sort of red light on them. You can sort of see the mask. They sometimes will put their hands into these oven mitts, and they sort of cast them into this sort of fuzzy nothingness. Some people could stay there for hours, and there were other people who couldn't stand it for even a couple of minutes. The interesting thing was there was no psychological test at the time that could predict who was going to behave in which way. So Robert Zuckerman, who was the father of sensation seeking, actually created a new test, abandoned his research on the sensory deprivation, and came up with this disruption which was called sensation seeking. So sensation seeking is the trait that's defined by the seeking of varied, novel, and complex and intense sensations and experiences, and the willingness to take either physical or social or legal or even financial risks for the sake of those experiences. He thought that some people were people who were after these different sort of sensations, and some people were sort of opposed to them. And there were actually 4 different components to this sensation-seeking trait. And you actually might be high or low in each of these different 4 components. One of them was called thrill and adventure seeking. Now, when you think of a thrill seeker, you probably think of this trait. These are people who are sort of drawn to these dangerous kinds of things, like these wingsuits, or maybe people who love to drive fast, or those kinds of things. It's the danger that beckons the thrill and adventure seeker. How many of you think you might score high on this trait? Okay, yeah, great. Some of you actually may have already taken this test before. Another is called experience seeking. Experience seeking is sensation seeking of the mind and of the senses. These are people who are drawn to maybe travel or unusual people or even unusual foods, like this black hamburger that was all the rage in Japan a couple of years ago. Actually, about 3 or 4 years ago, a bunch of my friends were going to go to Hong Kong to travel for a while. And if you've ever looked at the New York Times, they have this thing called 36 hours. It's a way that you can sort of figure out what to do if you're going to be in a city for a couple of days. And it took us 3 months to get reservations to this restaurant that I've never been to before, but they were recommending in the New York Times. And if you're like me, what we did was after we got the reservations, I emailed the restaurant to find out like what the menu was going to be like. How many of you do that if you go to a restaurant you've never been to? I do the same thing. So I emailed them and said, I have not been to your restaurant before. Could you send me the copy of the menu? I would love to see what's going to be on this menu for this restaurant. And they emailed me back really quickly and they said, well, here's the thing. It's a 5-course meal. Everyone gets the same thing, and we don't actually tell you what you ate until the meal is over. How many of you are thinking, that sounds cool, I would do that? Okay, you would all score high on experience seeking. How many of you are thinking, I need to know what things are before I put them into my mouth? Then you, like me, would probably score low on experience seeking. Now, when you think of a thrill seeker, you probably think of those two things, like experience seeking and thrill and adventure seeking. Those will tell me the kinds of things you are likely to do as a thrill seeker. The last two things will tell me how much trouble you might get yourself into as a thrill seeker. One of them is called disinhibition. This is your ability to be able to withhold doing things. People that score low on this component always look before they leap. Those that score high, they just leap. Now, in some cities, they do this in Atlanta. They have this thing called Pants Off Subway Day. Do they do this here? In Atlanta, they get the day mixed up an awful lot. But you have to have some disinhibition to do stuff like this. And the last component is called boredom susceptibility. This is how easy it is for you to get bored and also how irritated you get when you get bored. Those that score low almost never get bored. Those that score high get bored very easily and they get irritated when they do get bored. So you can get 40 points altogether on this scale. The lowest score you can get is about 8 on the brief sensation-seeking scale, and the highest score you can get is 40. In my book, I have a lot of people who are 35s or 40. When I took this scale, I scored an 8 out of 40. I am a low sensation-seeking individual. How many of you are probably like me? Yes, my people. Okay, yeah. About 3 or 4 years ago, I went to Twin Falls, Idaho to do a workshop. I was teaching about the new DSM that came out a couple of years ago. And I was there talking about my interest in thrill seeking. And a lot of people there were saying, oh, if you're interested in thrill seeking, you're going to want to go to the bridge. I had no idea what they were talking about. I didn't know how interesting a bridge could be. But the bridge apparently is the only bridge in North America where you can base dive from this bridge whenever you want to. For those of you who don't know what base diving is, it's kind of like skydiving, but you have less time to wonder why you've done it. Because you're jumping from a lower point. So I got to the bridge, and I found these 4 people who were folding these things that looked like large kites on the ground, and the cab driver said, oh, those are jumpers. So I walked over to them and said, I'm writing this book about thrill seekers, and they said, well, we're going to jump in a second if you want to watch us. So I walked over to this part of the bridge, and I held my phone up, and they started waving at me. They said, no, come up on the bridge and watch us jump off of this bridge. Now, being a low sensation seeker, even being that close to the traffic was kind of unnerving for me. But I want to show you this little video here. This guy here, his name is Nick. Nick owns a parachute accessory company, and he moved to Twin Falls, like a lot of people do, to be closer to the bridge. Because if you like, how many of you have been skydiving before? Okay, it's kind of expensive, right? So if you had your own parachute like Nick does, you can just jump off whenever you want to. In his backpack is an old rescue parachute that he bought from a friend for $20. He's trying out this parachute today for the very first time. Let's watch as Nick tests out his parachute. Yay for Nick. Yes, so I will say I have not watched a lot of people jump from bridges before, but I kind of thought his chute opened up just a little bit late. And I will say I've never felt so uncool before in my entire life, but he texted me after the jump and he said, I think my chute opened up a little bit late. Can you send me the video of my jump? So I did. And I said, well, how did you feel, Nick, as you were falling and you noticed that your chute hadn't opened yet? And here's what he said. So I'm watching the ground rush up, and it's almost like an eerie, surreal feeling. And in a way, you're scared, but in another way, you're really calm and taking it all in. You're like, this is what's happening. I'm along for the ride, you know? I was like, sorry, Nick, I've got no idea what you're talking about. A lot of people who are not thrill seekers like me, a lot of the thrill seekers say they're really calm when this is going on. They don't have a lot of that adrenaline that you might think that they do, and there's a lot of neurological evidence that backs this up. Those with high sensation-seeking personalities actually have lower levels of stress hormones like cortisol, but they also have, so that means they're less stressed during those high sensation-seeking activities. They're not all pumped up with adrenaline like you might think they are. This might explain why they have those, they experience less stress, but they also have more pleasure neurotransmitters like dopamine. So they experience more pleasure than their low sensation-seeking friends. This comes in very useful for the hobbies that they do, the habits that they have, and the relationships and the careers they're drawn to, like first responder careers or emergency room physicians. You want that kind of high sensation-seeking personality for that kind of thing. So the book that I've written and the research I do is about how this kind of personality it really sort of draws individuals for certain kinds of things. So sensation-seeking is not just what a person does, it's sort of who they are as an individual. Thank you very much.